joining us as the Minister gets ready. She's just coming back from a great trip down to Houston to meet with some energy leaders and some U.S. lawmakers. So we'll turn it over to her for her statement.
Well, thank you, everyone. And I thought this might just be a good opportunity to give an overview of who I met with in Houston, what the Premier and I did down in Houston at CERAWeek over the past week, what we heard, and a little bit about the overall message that we were relaying. So to start with, what were some of the highlights of the week? So I was down there from Sunday till got home late last night, and I was able to, over the week, be able to meet with industry CEOs and executives, the financial community, academics and thought leaders, government officials from all over the world, industry analysts, and really the whole gambit of the energy sector, from the service sector to producers to the clean energy producers were there. It's an enormous conference. It's probably the biggest in the world. It's been going on for about 40 years, and so it was truly a privilege to be able to be down there. During the week, I participated in 2 panels, one moderated by Daniel Yergin with CEOs of the Pathways Initiative to Net Zero, so the CEO of Suncor and the CEO of Cenovus, to talk about their initiative and how they're getting to net zero. I was able to talk about energy security and how Alberta can help to be part of the solution. I also participated in a panel in the Innovation Agora on methane emission reductions and how Alberta is leading the way. It sets an example for North America. I was able to participate in a roundtable on U.S. energy infrastructure with U.S. Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm. That was moderated by Daniel Yergin as well. I also had the opportunity ahead of that session to speak with her and to be able to let her know that Alberta can be part of the solution, that we'd be in a position to replace about 1/3 of the imports of Russian barrels into the U.S., and that we can be part of the solution. I met with the API, the Industry Association in the United States, to talk about North American energy security, how we can work together and to reset energy policy. I met with producers, a number of companies. I participated in a roundtable with Premier Kenney with a number of global CEOs to talk about Alberta as a place to invest and why to come to Alberta. Was at a dinner with innovators and generally a lot of the business community on both sides of the border with the Premier while he was there. Minister Wilkinson was also at that, as was BC Minister Bruce Ralston. Was able to participate in the carbon management hub, which was kind of a meeting place to talk to innovators from both sides of the border. As well as that, there's numerous other meetings and hallway sessions. I attended many panels from CEOs and experts. So throughout all of it, started to hear a consistent message coming from CERAWeek. And while was considerable talk still about the transition and reducing emissions, there's really a pretty clear theme coming through from CERAWeek as a whole. And generally, it's that governments needs to start treating our oil and gas reserves as a strategic asset to be proud of, not a liability to phase out. Generally, our energy production is something we should be proud of and support, not vilify. We heard that throughout the conference from almost everyone. And I think the Russian invasion of Ukraine put a spotlight on all of this, a spotlight on energy security. And at the same time, it affirmed that oil and gas is going to continue to be produced. We're going to continue to need it for decades. The supply disruption and the need to weed out Russian barrels really put a strong focus on this. And it put a really strong focus on the weakness of North American energy policy. We've now run headfirst into the fact that over the past several decades, the growing focus on energy policy in Western democracies has been almost exclusively on climate change and the need to reduce emissions. to the detriment and to the leaving out of discussion on energy security, reliability, and affordability. And governments around the world have dropped the ball on energy security. The failure to prioritize energy security has now put the U.S. administration into the somewhat embarrassing predicament of having to beg their own producers, domestic producers in the U.S., to increase their production of oil, while over the past years they've been vilifying them and trying to keep it, literally adding red tape and making it difficult. They've also in the embarrassing position of having to go to places like Venezuela, Iran, Saudi Arabia, OPEC, to ask for increased barrels and increased production to replace Russian barrels. Like, you literally can't make any of this up. And that was evident throughout the weekend, the ironies and the hypocrisy and the contradictions of failed energy policy. Failed North American energy policy has put us in a place here in North America where it's been pretty difficult to maintain or grow our own energy production, and it's made it literally impossible to build infrastructure to get our product to market. And now even, ironically, some even in the Trudeau government are now talking about how can we get more production into the U.S., how can we get more natural gas over to Europe to help meet the energy crisis. Of course, that means pipelines and building infrastructure after years of trying to shut it in. So meanwhile, while Western democracies in North America has been focused on exclusively on climate policy, which is important, but has ignored energy security, places like Russia have been able to ramp up production without making any effort whatsoever to address climate change. So what this has meant is it's a transfer of production of oil and gas from North America to places like Russia. It's also a transfer of greenhouse gas emissions to those places, and it's a transfer of wealth from Western democracies to places like Russia. And what it's done is it's kind of validated some of the things that Premier Kenney and myself and many, many others have been saying for a very long time. And that's that leaving a barrel of oil in the ground here in Canada, in North America, just means that another barrel will be taken out of the ground somewhere else. And in this case, it's shone a pretty strong spotlight that is places like Russia. While our own industry has faced divestment campaigns, environmental activism to block infrastructure, additional costs and uncertainties, things like Bill C-69, the tanker ban, while we've imposed all of that on our energy industry here in North America, Russia and others have faced none of that. So what we've accomplished is basically locking in our own production and transferring that production and wealth to other places. So what's the solution, and what was my message at CERAWeek this week? So over the week, I tried to consistently convey that we now have a moment in time where we can just step back and be able to have a rational conversation. We have a discussion about, yes, the world is in an energy transition. We need to address climate change. But yes, we are doing that. But the transition is going to take time, and it's not going to be easy, and it's not going to be simple, and oil and gas will continue to be used during that transition for decades. The question is simply, where is that going to come from? Where is the oil and gas going to come from? Is it going to come from North America, or are we going to cede that to places like Russia? And I was also conveying the fact that we can be part of the solution. Alberta producers can be part of the solution. We can be part of the solution for both global energy security and especially for North American energy security. We sit on top of the third largest reserves of oil on the planet. We're the fourth largest producer in the world, and we are already the largest energy supplier in the United States market. So yes, it's frustrating. I was asked a lot of questions about how frustrating it must be coming from Alberta and having seen recently KXL pipeline vetoed. So yes, it is terribly frustrating to see the U.S. government now scrambling to increase supply from some of the world's worst regimes, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, And yet we sit right next door. We sit right next door on top of the third largest reserves. We have an industry that's committed to net zero production in the oil sands. We're a responsible democratic government, so it is very frustrating. And it's even more frustrating at times that our own federal government has made it so difficult for our oil and gas sector and really has vilified the sector since it came into power in 2015. And we all know that background. We all know it. It's vetoed, canceled pipelines. It's Bill C-69. It's the tanker ban in case any other company decided they wanted to build a pipeline. And now it's it's an emissions cap on oil and gas production and the just transition that they're pursuing, and they're actually pursuing very aggressively. And at the same time, they're talking with our global partners and other countries, whether it's the G7 or the International Energy Agency. They're talking with them about how we can increase and grow production to displace Russian barrels. So yes, it's extremely frustrating and it's hypocritical. So over the week, I heard from producers, particularly producers and analysts, about how the world can sort out some of the issues around supply and the energy crisis. Learned that we're not going to solve that with a release of barrels from the strategic petroleum reserves around the world. It's not going to be solved by asking OPEC to increase production. They've indicated they're not going to. Certainly not going to help to go to Venezuela or Iran. U.S. producers themselves can increase production a little bit, but after a year of being demonized, they're not that particularly interested, and it'll take a while to ramp up in any event. And Alberta producers can help somewhat in the short term. As I mentioned, we can probably get another 200,000 to 400,000 barrels down there, displacing a third of the Russian barrels. But the failure to build infrastructure over the last number of years hampers that ability somewhat. So, I guess the other, on top of the concerns, how do we increase production? We have the G7 and the International Energy Agency saying we need to increase production, calling upon everybody and anybody that can to do so. And yet it was just recently in COP26 when many of those G7 countries were there talking about a more rapid phase-out of oil and gas production. The International Energy Agency is making the same sort of call, and yet just last year it was saying that we cannot see any new oil-filled production basins come into play because we need to rapidly get off of fossil fuels. So it is incredibly frustrating, and it exposes the folly of energy policies over the last number of years. Shows that what we're in the middle right now is a very disorderly energy transition that's leading to chaos. And what we need to do is very thoughtfully, carefully step back, reset that policy. We have an opportunity to have a quiet, thoughtful discussion about a careful rebalancing of all the needs in an energy policy to lower emissions and to address climate change, and at the same time to do that in a way that we're not going to compromise energy security. So that's generally the message that I was conveying, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Minister. So we'll take some questions from reporters now. A couple ground rules. So if you're in a room, if you don't mind going up to the mic, that way folks on the line can hear you. But if you could identify your name and outlet, it'd be one question, one follow-up. Seeing none in the room, I guess we'll go to the phones. Operator, first question.
Politics. Yes, thank you. Minister, I was wondering some of the comments the Premier made about Keystone XL recently, and that is potentially we could see Alberta perhaps kick-starting that, like getting it going, much like the federal government, Liberal government, bought out Trans Mountain, expanding it. Is this possible that if nobody comes forward privately, that you could take over the Keystone XL pipeline, in a sense, have the province own it and build it?
Well, it's. I think what we clearly need to do is build more infrastructure. There's some short-term solutions to get additional barrels across the border in in the short term. In the longer term, whatever form it may look at, whoever owns it, whoever builds it, constructed, pipeline routes, etc., we need to get more market access in the long run, and that's been made really, really clear. KXL, just incidentally, was originally supposed to be in service and built and moving product in 2012, 2013, like a decade ago. After being vetoed twice, it's understandable why the proponent, TC Energy, is not interested in pursuing it any longer. But it is whatever we go, it is really clear we need to build some additional infrastructure. So as a starting point on that, I think one of the initial first starting points we could do to send a message that we need to build that infrastructure is the federal government could rescind immediately the tanker ban under C-48 so that we can look again at another West Coast pipeline in the future. It could reopen Bill C-69, the Impact Assessment Act, to find a process that actually allows a project proponent to build something, not something that'll be mired down in a process you can never get through. So I think those are some immediate near-term things the federal government can do. If it's serious about what Minister Wilkinson had mentioned, they're serious about finding ways to get additional product to market, they can start with those things. And then I think we can have the discussion about KXL and how we get more product to the United States.
Follow-up?
Yes, absolutely. So just to be clear, we have this precedent where the federal government in Canada bought out the Trans Mountain Pipeline project. It's actually twinning that. It's going to cost over $20 billion. So there's a precedent right now for governments in Canada to take over pipeline projects. Again, would Alberta then consider, if the TC Energy is saying it's not interested in moving ahead with the Keystone XL pipeline, but would Alberta now step up and put taxpayers' dollars into, just like the federal government did with Trans Mountain, would Alberta take over that and actually build that project?
Well, I think first things first, we have to get the policy right. We have to do that step back and relook at North American energy security policy, continental energy security policy, because we need assurances on both sides of the border that energy matters, that supply matters, that security of supply matters, that pipeline projects can be built, not only tomorrow, but in the long term. So I think we need the policy setting correct before we can determine the appropriate markets to get to it. But at this point, I would say, yes, everything is on the table in the future to look at. We know for sure that the world needs more energy from Alberta, whether it's LNG pipelines or oil and gas pipelines. We need more product. We need increased capacity to get product to market. What that looks like needs to be looked at in terms of a proper reset of energy policy.
Next question.
Chris Barco, Calgary Herald.
Yeah, Minister, we've seen obviously a response from oil and gas markets with price spikes experienced over the last 2 weeks. I'm wondering what impact are you hearing and what impact are you seeing that the price spike is going to have on Alberta oil and gas production? Do you see it leading to another boom, or do you see the producers just remaining on the sideline?
Well, I think we heard a lot of conversations of this down in Houston, what can be expected on both sides of the border to increase production. In our conventional sector, I think there's a room to increase a little bit, just the similar in the United States. Right now, there's some supply constraints, some supply chain constraints. It's difficult to get rigs. Sand is difficult. It's difficult to be able to ramp up just because of the supply chain, but certainly we could see some smaller incremental increase in production. The oil sands, I think there's some interest in there, and we heard from producers how they could increase production in the short term with things like, scheduling their maintenance turnarounds, optimizing production at existing facilities. There's some additional production that is set and could come on in the very near term. So yes, I do think we can, in the near term, we can increase production. I think you can expect to see that. In the longer term, to increase production, we have to make sure there's an energy policy that supports that and encourages that, and we need to see that there's takeaway capacity from pipelines, rail, and other infrastructure to move it.
Follow-up, Chris?
Yeah, you talked about some of the conversations you were having. Were you hearing increased interest in the Alberta oil sands specifically? And I guess what has to happen to, take that into actual production increases? In other words, how do you translate any increase of interest into actual investment?
Yeah, absolutely. There was increased interest in the oil sands production. First and foremost, it's moving to net zero. Net zero production gives it a strategic advantage to be low carbon as well as low risk. It's long-term projects that are relatively low risk and low cost. We heard the production of some of these up and running oil sands facility can compete with any production anywhere around the world. And the interest in the increased oil sands production is particular down in the Gulf Coast, where refineries are configured to take that more heavy blend of crude. And in fact, they were importing Russian, heavy blend of Russian crude that needs to be displaced. And they're not going to displace that from Venezuela. They shouldn't be looking at displacing it from Iran or Saudi Arabia. They should be looking north, and they are. We just have to find the solutions to get it across the border. And I trust wholeheartedly our industry to step forward and find the right solutions. If governments can get out of the way and be able to support them and give them the energy policy they need to be able to increase that production.
Next question.
Jamie Dole, Global News.
Hi there. Just wondering what impact that the new introduced sanctions that Canada has imposed this morning could be having on companies here in Western Canada and some of their employees.
Well, I think I'll take a step back further from that on the Canadian ban of Russian oil, and I think that was a very proud moment that Canada was one of the first countries to ban the import of Russian crude and petroleum products. The Americans followed suit, and I think that's something we should be pretty pleased with, because it's unconscionable to be continuing to support Russia's war financially by purchasing and importing their crude. I think as you looked at other broader sanctions of the Russian industry, we do need to look at that. Any possibility and options that you're enabling the Russian army to be able to commit those atrocities in Ukraine, we do need to look at it. In fact, in Alberta, we have started to look at all of the oil and gas leases to determine if there is Russian ownership of some of the oil and gas wells in Alberta and see what can be done about that. It doesn't look at this point that there is significant or really much of any Russian ownership of oil and gas leases, but we're looking at that, and I think all of the Western world needs to continue to do that.
Follow-up?
Yes, we have seen some connections with some Russian oligarchs to companies that are in Western Canada, like Evra Steel, that is in Calgary and Red Deer and in Edmonton, that did provide a huge amount of steel for some pipeline projects. Will those employees be impacted at all by the sanctions imposed on these Russians that have the financial ties to these companies and are huge shareholders in some of these companies?
Well, I think we have to probably wait and see how that unfolds and wait to see how some of these sanctions unfold before we know the impact. I know as we looked at some of the things in Alberta, Russian ownership, if there was any, was fairly insignificant compared to ownership of Canadian companies. So it gets more challenging to sort that out.
And we'll go to our last question.
Dave Kaiser, City News.
Hi, good morning. Thanks for taking my question. Minister, just curious, with oil prices still going up and people still paying more and more for fuel every day here, are there any other plans for relief aside from the 13 cents off a liter that won't come into effect for another 3 weeks here?
Well, I think we continue to look at ways of making energy affordable for Albertans. We continue to look at that. We've done a number of things, including the removal of the gas tax. We'll continue to look at things. One thing, we know we're very proud of our oil and gas industry in Alberta. We're very proud of our energy supply to Albertans, and we'll make sure that it continues to be affordable. So I think we'll continue to look at those types of things to determine how to get through this energy crisis in the short term and other measures in the longer term.
Follow up?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, looking at it right now, Minister, what would you say needs to be done? I mean, just saying you'll look at it and determine things doesn't really help people who are at the pump right now paying significantly more than they were a week ago.
Well, I think the first thing that could be done is to take a long, hard look at the federal carbon tax. You want to look at increase in energy costs, look at the federal carbon tax, $50 a ton going up to on April 1st, continuing to move up to $170. That's 3 times the amount that it is today. So I think we need to take a look at that, and that goes right back into that whole discussion on energy policy and getting the right balance with climate change and the need to lower emissions. What we're seeing at going up to $170 carbon tax, that's going to significantly increase the cost of energy to every single Canadian. So that's something we can look at.
Thank you very much.